Welcome to the Happiness Index podcast. My name is Stefan Tornquist. I'm the Managing Director of Executive Summary Research and the writer of the Global Workplace Happiness Report. Over the next couple of months, I'm borrowing Matt Phelan's host chair to speak with the academics and experts who are contributing to the report. I'm in Brooklyn, New York. It's mid-January. It's pretty cold. They shut off our gas earlier today, so my cave-like office is even more grim than usual, but I'm very excited for our guest today. Mark Fabian is a reader in public policy at the University of Warwick. He's also an associate researcher at the the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at Cambridge. And for our Americans, for my fellow Americans, a reader is the equivalent of an associate professor. Mark, thanks very much for being here. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work that got you here?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks very much for the opportunity. I'm very excited to always talk about my work. So yeah, as you say, I'm a public policy scholar. I trained in economics originally and before that in philosophy. And basically, as I started to kind of try to apply economics to well-being related issues, so things like social care, mental health, happiness, what sort of built environments make people's lives go well, I started to realize that the economics and philosophy toolkit was just not really up to the task, and that I needed perspectives from sociology, geography, and then especially from policy studies. So a lot of my work historically has been on theorizing well-being, so trying to conceptualize what it is, how it works, how we can get it, how we can measure it, which is pretty important for science and really, really hard. Nowadays, I think much more about how we apply well-being either in organizations or especially in government. And a lot of my work is on what's called public management and public administration. So part of what's got us a bit stuck, I think, in the ill-being outcomes that we see today is that not enough attention is being paid to the paperwork of government. And it's often sort of the way that we do contracting and things like that that locks in these bad outcomes.
I would love to talk to you about that for this entire.
But that's my next book.
Unfortunately. So from what you've just said, I think everyone can see that you're a multidisciplinarian, an all-rounder, and that's why you were sort of perfect for the task that we gave you, which was not exactly a short history of well-being thinking and science, but it kind of takes that form, starting with some of the essential philosophical theories going back 2,000 years. It's more than 2,000, isn't it?
Yeah, a bit over, yeah.
But then, sort of moving through how they manifest in the real world. And you're good enough to mention Stoicism, because anybody who goes through an airport is like, oh, there's only one theory of life, and it's called Stoicism.
Mm-hmm.
So given all of that, how do you define well-being?
Yeah, so I have a slightly different or a kind of unique take. I don't think it will be unique for long, in the sense that I think a lot of people are converging on this kind of way of thinking academically and otherwise, which is basically that well-being is wholeness, would be the way I'd describe it. So it's your life fitting together in a way that is coherent for you, both at the individual level and in how you plug into your social networks and your wider culture. This way of thinking about well-being comes out of a recognition that well-being emerges from various complex processes. So within your own psychology, you have to bring about a kind of harmony between your emotions, the things that you're doing, the values that you're pursuing, and the motivations that you have to do things. If you think that something is the right thing to do, but you just don't have the kind of intuitive motivation to do it, then trying to pursue that thing is not going to get you to well-being. Equally, if you are very motivated to do things that are harmful to you, like consuming huge quantities of ice cream, then that's going to end up being bad for your well-being. So you've got to get a harmony there, and that takes time. There is a process by which those things become networked. And that's what I mean by things fitting together in a way that is coherent for you. The process might be similar for everybody, but the outcomes are going to be individualized. Similarly, then there's a psychosocial process where you're interacting with people around you. So you've got to be part of groups that nourish you. You've got to share values with the people that you care about. Then there's the kind of wider cultural and political economic systems that you fit into. Those also need to be conducive to your well-being. You can't live in an authoritarian state that represses you, to take a simple example. So all these different complex things have to be networked. They have to come together in ways that foster our flourishing. And I think there are a bunch of outcomes that we can look at typically if you're well, you're going to have better moods. You're going to be more satisfied with your life. You're going to have a sense of meaning and purpose. I would say that if you're really, really super thriving, then you might even have a sense of flow, which is the feeling of being lost in the zone or in the moment, but really generalized across your whole life. So you're kind of waking up in the morning and going to bed, and between those two incidents, you don't really have to stop and think like, why am I doing these things or whatever? It's just all good. And you're not even conscious enough of it to think, wow, I'm so happy. You're just doing it. And it's enjoyable, pleasant, fulfilling, valuable, meaningful, all that good stuff.
It would be very easy to get sidetracked with the political structures part of your definition.
Especially at the moment, yeah.
Again, just to put that to the side, let's hope that we can achieve some level of well-being regardless, sort of daily life and not necessarily always beset by the larger world over which we have so little control. So if in that complex structure, what does it even mean to think about well-being in the workplace versus in our wider lives? Or does it mean anything?
Yeah, I think it has a very large role to play. I think particularly, well, throughout all of history, humans have worked a lot and work has been a big part of most of our days. I think the thing to underline is that for most people, work is just one part of your life. It is not your whole life. I think there is this misperception, particularly in places like Silicon Valley or where hustle culture is really dominant, that you've just got to find the thing that you want to do and then you'll want to do it 12 hours a day, every day. Yeah. Well, sometimes I see this kind of stuff on LinkedIn or whatever, or, Reddit will have these forums about like toxic bosses and stuff like that. And then, you get these statements from people who are inevitably just trying to extract more labor from you by saying that, you just haven't found the thing for you or you don't have the right hustle mindset. I think for a lot of people who are fully self-actualized and know what they want from life, they will discover that work is just a part of it and they could potentially not even really think that much about their work. Maybe that it's just a thing that they do to make money and that's totally fine. Or maybe it's a thing that they do that they're really passionate about, but they only want to do it for 4 hours a day or whatever it might be. So coming back to my earlier definition, you've got to think about how work fits into the broader story of your life, the broader structures of your life. And for some people, that's going to mean working all the time in something that they super care about. And for other people, it's going to be a completely different story.
Yeah. There's the perception of the individual and the role that work plays. And then there's the organization trying to understand that same thing from the other side, both in aggregate and individually. And we'll get into that in a bit. But going to the essay, so we somewhat follow its structure. I like very much how you speak to some of the essential philosophical underpinnings and then talk about how they manifest in some of the economic models with which that we live in and under. For example, you suggest that a lot of these models assume that preference satisfaction, getting what you want, is the definition of well-being. I'll send up a straw man. Where does that work and where does it break down?
Yeah, it's a great question. I really love that question. So preference satisfaction is the way economics thinks about well-being. I think, again, there is a misperception, I think, in the wider public that economics only cares about money. It's actually economics in its academic form thinks that getting what you desire is what is well-being. And the more money you have, broadly speaking, the more things that you desire you can buy. So money is kind of a reasonable proxy in some cases, in many cases, I would say, for whether you are more or less well. In capitalism and in like American culture, and I think to a lesser extent British culture and Australian culture, there is a wider kind of valuation of having a lot of money. They're materialist cultures, but that's separate from economics. The point of the economics approach, I think, is to give us traction. It's a modeling tool. If you assume that well-being is preference satisfaction, and there's good reasons to think that, and then if you make this further assumption that's more heroic, that we can measure it with money, then you can start to do all sorts of modeling, like demand and supply models, like cost-benefit analysis. And some of these things are really powerful. And I think we want to be aware of where these things give us useful insights and where they go too far. So I think at the level of individual markets, like the market for apples or the market for electric cars or something like that, this way of thinking about well-being and this way of modeling it works super well. It gives us incredibly powerful insights. It's been a huge part of why the second half of the 20th century saw such tremendous improvements in the standard of living. I think at other scales, it doesn't work so well. And in certain contexts, it doesn't work so well. So thinking about your individual life as just getting your preferences satisfied is too limited. You've got to think about which preferences, why are those preferences suitable for you, and how do you discover that process? Thinking about just making heaps of money is a very bad idea. I think the FIRE movement, financial independence, retire early, they kind of get this wrong, I think. So if you retire early, you've still got to figure out what it is that you want to do with yourself. And so you're just putting the cart before the horse or kicking the can down the road or whatever the metaphor is. And then I think the context where it really doesn't work is things like the care sector and anything that's more qualitative, difficult to measure, anything that has a kind of strong existential or spiritual element, anything where it's hard to think about preferences in a very discrete way, and especially things where it's hard to get money into it or where that would actually like poison it and ruin the thing, then we should stay away from this way of thinking about well-being.
And doesn't it sort of presuppose, if you're trying to use it across a broader life for yourself, say, that our preferences are not, that they're all in harmony? Like if I would imagine if someone were without sort of any other thought, just to sort of list their top 20 preferences, some of those would be in conflict. You know, like I want to make a lot of money, but I want a family and I want to spend time with I want this and I want that, and we might work towards all of those in little ways and constantly and not have, a personal structure for try to bringing those into alignment.
That's absolutely right.
Whenever the topic of compensation comes up, I know that there's research that suggests, sort of at a certain point, that number must fluctuate with inflation and so forth. But at a certain point, the relative impact of our compensation kind of flattens out. Is that still the thinking and the discipline?
Yeah, I think that's broadly true. So there's like a lot of technical stuff I could go into here, but I won't. So what you're referring to is called the Easterlin paradox. It's basically, that there is a logarithmic relationship between life satisfaction measured on a 0 to 10 scale and your income. And we can see this at the individual level and we can also see it at the national level. And it basically means, because it's logarithmic, that the early increases in your income produce quite big increases in your life satisfaction. So when you go from being a student and you can, barely afford to go to the cinema or whatever, and then you get your first kind of solid job, and now you can eat out a bit more often and that kind of stuff, go on more holidays or better holidays. That has a big improvement. If you're wealthier, obviously your expenses increase. Like you might want to buy a house, and in a lot of places that's like borderline impossible nowadays for my generation. But in any case, it just doesn't seem to have the same effect because it's logarithmic. So it's flattening out this way. Now, some academics like Justin Wolfers would say that, well, we just need to keep increasing income. I think that's kind of crazy. Doubling $150,000 salary is going to cost too much of the environment, too much of our sanity under capitalism, things like that. I think we should look for other ways to improve people's well-being. And I think that comes back to what you were saying at the start there about making our preferences coherent and trying to figure out what our preferences are as individuals specific to us. And I'll shamelessly shout out my book here. I do talk extensively in the book about that process. So how you can introspect on your emotional and motivational signals, figure out your values, figure out what it is that is going to bring you specifically well-being. And I think in most cases, it's not going to be more income or more technology or something that's over the next horizon. It's something that you can probably do right now.
So from, some of our viewers today are business leaders, HR leaders. So I don't know that the message from that is great. Pay people up to a point and you're done. But in a very practical way, compensation packages are the most, it's the most obvious and easiest lever to try to increase satisfaction or well-being rather. Mm-hmm. But obviously it does tail off. I think people who are mid-career have observed that in their own lives. Like, yes, it matters, but I don't know how many people post-pandemic said, now that I've experienced a hybrid or remote life, you can't pay me enough to go back in 5
Yeah.
week. That's literally true for and then more metaphorical for others.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the question is, from an organizational standpoint, especially if you think about those sort of highest performing folks, that 10% that have an outsized effect on your corporate outcomes, your organizational outcomes. And I would suspect that group is, they're probably pretty well compensated. They probably have a relative feeling of freedom. Like, if it doesn't work out here, it'll work out somewhere. So, and this might be too granular a question, but what would you think about if you were, you're in the position of like, well, I've got these researchers working under me and I really want to keep these three. I'm already paying them what I can pay them. What would you do next to discover?
Absolutely. Number one thing is job crafting. So that's a kind of catch-all term in the workplace wellbeing literature for giving people not just kind of autonomy over how they execute their work, but as much flexibility as is tolerable for your organization, because it's going to be different depending on the firm and the sector it's operating in, but to shape the way that they work. So you've already mentioned working from home and the flexibility around that sort of stuff, flexibility around when you pick your kids up from school or childcare or whatever it might be. In academia, a lot of people are night owls and they like to work at 2 a.m. and that would be very difficult in a lot of organizations. And I have several colleagues who are like, the best thing about my job is that I can work after midnight. So trying to identify those sorts of things that people care about. And it might be even just things like what sort of paperwork processes they have to abide by, and they might really annoy them. And if you can say, I'll get rid of that stuff for you, keep working for me, that will have a big effect on retention. The other things to consider, and I think there are a bunch of perks in here that are probably related to compensation, but are slightly different, like maternity leave and paternity leave. I'm expecting a child at the end of July and I get 2 weeks of leave here in the UK, whereas my mates back home in Australia get 6 months. And I can certainly see that as a big draw card for me to go back to Australia. So I think there's a bunch of stuff like that to look out for. And then one thing that I think is also worth flagging is the kind of values proposition. And this is not available for a lot of firms, but the kind of work that people are doing and whether that contributes to something greater than themselves and their personal ambitions, whether there's meaning and purpose, whether the workplace is genuinely a place that they want to go to, whether their colleagues are friends of theirs. If I recall correctly, the number one predictor of job satisfaction is whether you have a friend at work that you like hanging out with. So kind of making it possible to cultivate those kind of friendships at work and hang out in ways that are conducive to that, I think is really important. And that's about much more than what's written in a contract. That's about the spaces that you cultivate. So I think there's quite a lot that you can potentially work on that goes beyond just the salary offering.
Yeah. It'd be fascinating to see with remote or largely remote folks, whether, is there something, can there be something? Because it's very hard to become really good friends with someone entirely virtually. It absolutely happens, but it takes more time, more, sort of more intentionality. It doesn't happen quite as organically.
Yeah, well, academia knows all about that because usually you're the only person in your department who really works on what you're working on. So your best friend is someone you know on Twitter or Blue Sky or whatever it might be. And then you meet them at a conference like once a year. And I have some of my closer friends are people that I basically met online first, and then we eventually had an opportunity to hang out more thoroughly. I've got a mate, Malta, at Pomona College in Los Angeles. He comes over to Europe for a couple of months a year because he's German originally. And then we sort of hang out and we go rock climbing and stuff like that. And it's a very solid friendship.
Yeah, it absolutely can, can happen. All right, let's get back to the essay. So you distinguish between a hedonism, sort of the pleasure drives, and the, I've only ever read this word, eudaimonic. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yeah, you got it right. Yeah.
Shouldn't
That's how
have
I
admitted it.
pronounce it anyway. Maybe I've got
Yeah.
it wrong as
Well, I
well.
could have said, oh, that's how Americans say it. Uh,
Okay. Yeah.
Eudaimonic. I don't know how would we make that as ugly as we can? I'll have to work on that. And so that refers to, and I'm simplifying, sort of flourishing and functioning in an environment. Um, I don't want to minimize hedonism with like that's pizza parties and ping pong
hmm
tables, but that's kind of an obvious
hmm
dig to take at the modern workplace.
Sure.
It's a lot easier to do that stuff.
hmm
Like, hey, we've got free lunches on Thursday, than it
hmm
is to look at something that's, uh, how do you encourage flourishing
Mm.
as a business?
Mm.
And do you go back to my definitions and correct?
Sure. You did a good job. So maybe in defense of hedonism first, we often talk about the pleasure side, but I would also emphasize the potential for misery in the workplace, and that often it's more important to get rid of those sources of misery than to focus on whether people are really cheerful. The main one for me in my work is always bureaucracy and just the kind of the amount of paperwork I have to do for stuff that's trivial. And I've been having a lot of frustrations with IT this year and not being able to use my own devices and stuff like that. So I think talking to your workers and discovering what makes them miserable at work and addressing that can be really powerful.
It's really
The eudaimonic view, I think a useful way of thinking about it is that it's always grounded in our nature in some way. The way psychologists think about it is that humans have evolved to be a particular kind of organism, and there are things that we need as that sort of organism to make us well. So like obviously food and stuff. But then we'll talk a bit later, I guess, about basic psychological needs and some of this sort of stuff. More broadly than that, eudaimonia is the stuff I was talking about earlier, that your life fits together in a way that is coherent for you, and as a result of that, you're flourishing. Everything in that life is going well, and mood is like an indicator of that. So the pleasure comes from that, but is not the thing that we should be focusing on. In terms of fostering it, you're absolutely right, because it revolves around connecting up all these complex things. So we've got to have spaces that people like hanging out in. We've got to have a workplace culture where people feel valued, where people are not doing terrible stuff to each other. I think a lot of high-performing institutions encourage people to be a bit psychopathic. It certainly seems to me to be a strong correlation between success, prestige, and people who have dark triad personality traits, which is very hard to avoid that correlation, but we want to work on getting rid of it. The main advice I have is, and it's tricky, like I'm not an expert on this by any means, but you've got to give your HR professionals autonomy and discretion to kind of shape that environment. It's very difficult to bring about flourishing if you are very strictly fixated on measurable outcomes, because most of the building blocks of it are not particularly measurable. They're observable, but they're going to be things like, I love this scene in Ted Lasso. I mentioned this in the piece I wrote for you guys, where he comes in, he's running this UK football club, and he has a suggestion box. And the only suggestion that he gets in the box that's constructive is that there's no hot water pressure in the showers. And that's exactly the kind of thing that on its own is going to lead to a small hedonism spike, not going to create flourishing by itself. But if you take care of dozens of these kind of small things, then you're going to get to that eudaimonic situation at work. But that requires HR people and other staff who are they're in amongst the people, observing what's going on, talking to them, and you've got to foster that kind of more qualitative relational approach.
It's funny. Like every family, we watched Ted Lasso over the course of
It's a good show.
the pandemic, and first couple of seasons are really lovely television. But working on this project, I sort of looked back at that show, like, oh, that whole show is about workplace well-being.
Yeah, absolutely.
And interestingly, the happiest, most sort of connected person, Ted, has an absolute breakdown at several points, and it has to do with his eudaimonic connections.
Yeah, that's right. He's got the kind of stuff that therapy deals with. He's got some blockages as a result of trauma, and so he's not allowing his emotions to move freely through him, and he's not able to connect up and address the structural issues that he has.
All right, so Stoicism.
Yeah,
it's the philosophy of the moment, or the structural approach.
It is so hot right now.
And you mentioned that it's a theory of how well-being works, not what it is.
Yeah.
So how does the sort of Stoic resilience fit into either the traditional corporate environment or the environment you're suggesting we try to develop?
So I'm a huge fan of Stoicism, and I think it does have a lot of just like 24 karat gold in it. And I think particularly one of the things that I value and appreciate in Stoicism is that it takes morality quite seriously. Like it thinks that being a values-led person is quite fundamental to your well-being. And so you should spend time kind of cultivating those aspects of your personality and being really attentive to them. The way Stoicism tends to become kind of wrong-headed, and I think particularly in the context that you alluded to, is where people think of it as a kind of like manly man's doctrine or something like that, and they become really like rationalist about being stoic, where they're like, I need to like separate myself from my emotions so that I can stoically soldier through my high stress, challenging job. I don't think that that's a good reading of Stoicism, but it's especially not a way of applying Stoicism that's appropriate to the modern world. So when the Stoics were writing, on the birth of Christ and yeah, I mean, that was a time characterized by dysentery. You could die randomly from a fever. Marcus Aurelius.
Plagues every few years.
Yeah. I mean, like stuff was bleak. And just, Marcus Aurelius lost a son and he was always at war and just like, death and destruction around him. Of course, he had to cultivate some equanimity. But nowadays, I think we live in very different environments. And if your workplace or your life is the kind of environment that requires you to kind of fortify your mental health with iron bars. Like there's this phrase that I despise, like optimize your mental health. If you're using Stoicism in that sort of way, then I think you've kind of missed the point. And I do see a lot of these kind of like manfluencer types advocating for that kind of reading of Stoicism. And I don't think that's helpful in the workplace or in your life. There's a lot of other really good stuff in Stoicism though, that you should definitely get into. And a bit of that kind of equanimity aspect of Stoicism is also super helpful.
Here's another place where we could take I'll leave the strength of character of the manosphere aside as well, along with but is there a sort of granular way that someone who's is thinking about their organization might put Stoicism to work, try to lay the groundwork for some of the more helpful pieces? We talk about values a lot and vision and purpose a lot in the corporate world. And I don't want to be too cynical about it, but I think a lot of the time it deserves some cynicism.
Absolutely.
I mean, you can sort of tell by the way it had a heyday. Sort of the brand purpose, our corporate purpose. You'll still find them, but people talking about them, that bubble has sort of passed. What makes for a purpose? If we're making shoes, you can try to relate to think about all of the miles that get walked and the sort of human impact.
People need shoes.
Yeah. But they're probably not making good shoes.
Right. Yeah.
Is there something closer in where you can attach to where the employment of this group of people, the economic value that it's adding, the bonds that we're what is the there for that's closer in that an organization could get its arms around without bringing in a consultancy to say, you are here so people can walk to the highest mountain or what,
Yeah. Pass me a bucket kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So, I think you're absolutely right that some of this stuff needs to be treated with cynicism. And I think the cynicism is usually warranted where all this talk of meaning and family and purpose and the social impact and stuff is really just leveraged to extract more labor from the workers. And it's really just about maxing productivity for the benefit of the shareholders, not the workers themselves. There is, I think, a transition happening at the moment slowly where it's possible to do towards like the B Corp ethos, which was basically that profit is important. It's part of most businesses' reason for being. It's part of most people's motivation for being in the private sector. But there's a bunch of other stuff that business does. Often it has a social impact. Often it has impacts through its supply chain on the people who work for it and the materials that it sources and how sustainably that's done, this kind of stuff. And if you're attentive to those sorts of things, you can create a business that not only generates a profit, maybe not profit max, but in not generating a maximum profit, it generates a whole bunch of other benefits. They might be hard to measure, and so they might be a bit difficult to communicate to shareholders or to investors or whatever it might be, but they're nonetheless really important, and they're going to be particularly important to a lot of your workers. And I think the shoes example is a really good one, actually. So I sometimes say to people, if you want to do good in your life, you don't have to solve peace in the Middle East or whatever, or clean all the Pacific garbage patch out. People need biscuits, people need washing machines, people need shoes. And if you're going to provide that product for them in a way that's really good, while also not generating other harms like exploiting animals or exploiting workers or whatever it might be, then you're doing good in the world. Take pride in that sort of work. But then the key thing is to do that genuinely. Like we are here in this business trying to be a good business. And I see that in quite a lot of these co-ops, like Mondragon in Spain, which is like a special case because it was founded by a literal saint. But we can't all be Mondragons maybe, but there's a whole bunch of other, I think, great examples of companies that are taking this sort of more multidimensional approach to what they're trying to achieve. And if you recruit people into that who have this kind of more mission-driven, intrinsically motivated attitude to their work, and you don't exploit that, you rather nourish it and cultivate it and appreciate it, then I think we can all get great outcomes.
I want to go further with that, but in the interest of time, I think we need to talk about SDT.
Yeah.
Self-determination theory. And so this, I think I'm casting this right, that you described it as that kind of the bridge between HR and therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Can you walk us through, sort of start with the big three needs of self-determination theory, and then we'll get into some other questions.
Yeah. So obviously a lot of psychological theories have come across to organizational psychology, workplaces, HR, that sort of thing. SDT, I think, is one of the biggest ones, and it does have its roots, in my opinion at least, some people might disagree with me, in clinical practice. It's developed mostly by Richard Ryan and Ed Deci. They're working at Rochester. Rochester is where Carl Rogers was working. They're very much also in that kind of humanist tradition. It's called self-determination theory. Rogers was very big on self-determination, self-actualization, this kind of stuff. Yeah, and it emphasizes, or one of its main contributions is this notion that humans have three basic psychological needs for autonomy, competence, relatedness. Autonomy is the sense that you are volitional in your life, so you have control over it, you make choices. Competence is the feeling that you have the necessary skills at the things you care about. So I might not be good at building matchstick models of the Titanic, but I don't care, so it doesn't bug me. Whereas if I wasn't good at writing essays, then that would be very painful for the kind of things that I want to be doing with my life. And then finally you have relatedness, which is the feeling of being loved and cared for. Something like that. And I think that last one is even more crucial maybe than the other two for workplaces from a HR perspective. Competence is what you want for your productivity, but relatedness is the one you want for worker retention and this kind of stuff. And the idea is that if your basic psychological needs are met, then also your basic physical needs will be met because you'll go and take care of business, basically. If you're not eating, then you have the autonomy and the competence to go and get food, this sort of stuff. If your basic needs are met, then we'll see a bunch of indicators of that. You'll generally be in better moods, you'll generally be more satisfied with your life. You'll generally have more vitality because you're following things that you have an intrinsic motivation to do. If your needs are thwarted, then you're going to have all the opposites: depression, anxiety, other signs of psychopathology. You're going to be frustrated, stressed, irritable, this kind of thing.
Autonomy seems tough in a hierarchical organization, but maybe I'm seeing it from too narrow. There's working remotely, then suddenly you just get, sort of one kind of autonomy, certainly. So how do you own the outcome when you're in a massive matrix organization?
Yeah, that's really difficult. And I'm not a manager, so I almost have to just defer this one to people who are managers. There are certainly some jobs, like call center workers are a classic example, where you're just super controlled in your work. You have actually very little autonomy. You often have a script that you're reading. You have to scan barcodes to show exactly what you're doing every 10 seconds of your life. Even lawyers who have a lot of autonomy, because they're billed in 7-minute increments, they often need to be quite particular about how they manage their workday. And I think thinking about cultivating autonomy in an organization, you want to think less about again, the positive side of that and more about the negative side. So in what ways are you unnecessarily controlling people? I did come across quite a story that confirmed all my biases, I guess. So I enjoyed it, but about the CEO of Canva, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who basically massively reduced the number of people that needed to sign off on any decision. And that's, in their perspective, a big part of why Canva has grown so fast. And I think that's an example of thinking about where people are controlled rather than where they have autonomy. So if you are confident that you have hired good people, then let them get on with doing good work. And there are multiple ways that they could be constrained in that. And I can understand that there's risk and all sorts of things going on, but yeah, trim it back.
Side comment. There's a podcast I very much like that looks at the backstory and production history of films in the second half of the 20th century. And what's interesting about every one of the really great ones is that somehow a singular vision managed to make it to the end point, that it was not fantastic news. We've got, 10 people from the network are coming in with notes, which is not to say that you cannot collaboratively improve upon something. But there's also an argument to be made for certainly a creative element, whether it is a structured academic essay or a film. There's an argument to be made for at least that sort of core idea being carried forward by the person who's, sort of generated and passionate about it.
That reminds me just briefly of another point that's worth making here, which is that I think one way to cultivate autonomy is to try to limit the amount of managerialism that goes on in your organization. So that's this real top-down manufacturing kind of model of how you run a business, where there are the workers and there are the managers, and the managers are looking at spreadsheets and making their decisions on that basis. And you can contrast that with a kind of more relational way of doing things, where you are walking the shop floor a lot more, talking to your workers, asking them what's going on and what they need. And I think in what you've described there with the films, there is an inner group of people who are all collaborating with each other in a very relational way. And then the people from the studio come in, or however you described it, they're the managers who are like, oh no, we're looking at our key performance indicators and general focus groups, and we think that this character needs to be radically changed in a way that's completely divergent from your vision. Or to take a recent example, we're going to bring in a bunch of people to act in Star Wars shows who have no love for Star Wars.
Right.
That's never going to go down well with that community. So things like that. Yeah,
the classic. So instead of dying at the end, could they live?
Yeah. Can we have a happy ending?
Yeah. So, all right. One more sort of formal question here, which is you mentioned beneficence as a potential fourth element of self-determination theory. And you do caveat that with the science being early. But so what is beneficence, and is there a relationship to the wider sort of community or societal impact of a company?
So I want to shout out to my colleague, Frank Martella, who kind of came up with this idea in partnership with Richard Ryan from self-determination theory. And Frank is an organizational psychologist. So he actually someone definitely worth checking out if you're into workplace wellbeing. And I think I gave you a link to one of his recent papers
and we'll
on this stuff.
Footnote that from your essay.
Yeah, great. Beneficence is basically the sense that you are contributing in a kind of altruistic way to, you could say something beyond yourself, but maybe just a community that's wider than your individual needs. And I think this is quite relevant to contemporary late stage capitalism, hopefully late stage. I live in London. London is this intense pressure cooker of a city where so many people are just thinking about what they need to do in their life to get ahead on their career goals or life goals or whatever it might be. And it means that there's very little solidarity in London. So even when you do something nice for someone, you make space for them on the bike path or something like that, they won't even notice, let alone say thank you, because they're so locked into what they're doing. And I think this can be quite toxic to well-being of everyone. Humans, our superpower as a species is cooperation, but we need to foster that, cultivate it. So the beneficence aspect is to think more about how we get people to recognize that they are embedded in teams, that they are embedded in communities, and what they contribute to that community as well as get from it, and how they can make that a nourishing relationship.
Mark, thank you so much. we'd like to end these podcasts with something that the Happiness Index has been doing in their pods for quite a while, which is to ask, and I think we might have we had a clue in the course of the podcast. What's making you happy?
Yeah. So as I said, I've got a child on the way, which I'm very excited about. I'm 39, and I thought I'd be a young dad. So it's been a long
In New
time
York,
coming.
you'd be a young dad.
Right, yeah, that's true. Well, in London as well, but I can't say that it's great here. But anyway, touch wood that's all going to work out fine. And I think more broadly, I'm in a very, very loving relationship, and I think love is like terribly understudied in wellbeing science, and I think it's the number one thing for your wellbeing. We talk about relationships as the number one thing, but love is, I think, a whole kind of separate category within that. More broadly than that, one thing I've been musing on a lot lately is that most of the things that make me feel really well are quite mundane. I'm in the fortunate position where I've achieved a lot of my goals, and I'm still quite young. And I look around, and it wasn't like the achievement of those goals that really made me happy. When I think of athletes, for example, like you win Wimbledon or the Super Bowl or whatever it might be, and you're like, yeah, and the crowd's there with you, and there's that huge like cathartic payoff. I don't think that's how you should think about well-being. Maybe there'll be a spike like that, but it won't last very long. What you want to do is organize your life in a way that it generates these frequent, pleasant, fulfilling, valuable experiences. And that can be quite mundane. That's available to all of us. How we invest in our friendships, how we invest in our communities, how we invest our time in our hobbies and our workplaces and these kind of things. We can get all those payoffs all the time. You don't have to be Jeff Bezos or a rock star or whatever.
Well, I can't imagine a better way to finish this off than that. Mark, thank you so much for your time. And to all of you who are listening, thank you for your time. We'll see you next time.
I appreciate it.
With another academic or expert who's contributed to the Global Workplace Happiness Report. Have a great day.